Hello, everybody. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Kay. Hey, Steve Gunzo. Lindsey Graham, thanks. Kristen Cinema and Joe Manchin for upholding the filibuster. And Dolores says, hi, everyone. Lana says, hi, folks. Dolores Pierce says, sharing. Thank you, Dolores. And Dolores is here again on Facebook and on YouTube. 2 places at once. Steve says, cows should not be grain fed. I guess they should be grass fed, shouldn't they? Guess they do better with grass, but they're still huge sources, of methane gas, aren't they? Maybe we just need to go off of cows altogether. Lana says grass fed is best. Yes, I guess that's true. Okay, the topic for tonight is Empire Follies. What it's about is our efforts in various corners of the world to maintain the neoliberal empire that is feeding the corporate oligarchy, because that is what's happening, and it keeps causing us a raft of trouble. So let's go after a bunch of news on that and see what's been going on. This piece, which I picked up in LA Progressive, it's called "The Afghan Graveyard Welcomes New Resident." Guess who that resident is? It's a piece by Medea Benjamin of Code Pink and Nicholas Davies, who is becoming a co-author of her reasonably frequently of late. And they point out that President Biden announced the removal of all U.S. troops by September 11th. But he failed to include some important details. An Afghan taxi driver in Vancouver told one of us a decade ago, that's a long time ago already, that this day would come. Quote, we defeated the Persian Empire in the 18th century, the British in the 19th, the Soviets in the 20th. And now with NATO, we're fighting 28 countries. But we'll defeat them too, said the taxi driver. Surely not a member of the Taliban, but quietly proud of his country's empire-killing credentials. While Biden is being pilloried by some for pulling out too soon, the truth is he is violating a May 1st deadline for U.S. troop withdrawal that was painstakingly negotiated under the Trump administration. Now, after nearly 20 years of a war that has been as bloody and futile as all those previous invasions and occupations, the last 3,500 U.S. troops and their NATO brothers in arms will be coming home from Afghanistan. President Joe Biden tried to spin this as the U.S. leaving because it has achieved its objectives, bring the terrorists responsible for 9/11 to justice, and ensuring that Afghanistan would not be used as a base for a future attack on the United States. We achieved those objectives, Biden says. Bin Laden is dead and Al-Qaeda is degraded. It's time to end the forever war. Well, yeah, it seems to me that was true, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago. So what have we been doing in the last 8 years there? What Biden did not admit is that the United States and its allies, with all their money and firepower, were unable to vanquish the Taliban, who currently control about half of Afghanistan and are positioned to control even more in the coming months without a ceasefire. Nor did Biden admit that in 2 decades, the U.S. and its allies have been unable to build up a stable, democratic, popular government or a competent military in the country. Like the USSR, the U.S. is leaving in defeat, having squandered the lives of countless Afghans, 2,488 U.S. troops and personnel, and trillions of dollars. So U.S. withdrawal, especially one not based on conditions on the ground, is nevertheless a bold move for Biden. He is going against the advice of the intelligence community and top officials at the Pentagon, including a head of the U.S. Afghan forces and the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Biden is also coming under attack from the Republicans, Democrats in Congress. Senator Mitch McConnell artfully slammed Biden's decision, accusing him of helping U.S. enemies, quote, ring in the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks by gift-wrapping the country and handing it right back to them, unquote. Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen, a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, said, "The withdrawal undermines our commitment to the Afghan people, particularly Afghan women. When we were going in there, I was unaware we were making any commitment to the Afghan people. We were going in there to get rid of the Taliban because we wanted to punish them for giving succor to bin Laden, and of course to get rid of Osama bin Laden too, and to get rid of Al-Qaeda. We had some success with respect to goals, but somewhere along the line, we who went in vowing we wouldn't be doing any nation building in Afghanistan started nation building in Afghanistan. When was it? About 2003, 2004? We started serious efforts to nation build in Afghanistan. Something we were never supposed to do because we didn't want to be screwed up there the way the Russians were. But while Biden is being pilloried by some for pulling out too soon, the truth is he's violating the May 1st deadline. I said that before. Ironically, Biden acknowledged in his speech on Wednesday that the withdrawal agreement the United States signed with the Taliban in February 2020 was a solemn commitment. But then he said U.S. forces would begin their withdrawal on May 1st and complete it by September 11th, which was not what was agreed to. So I guess it wasn't that solemn after all. After it was clear the United States was going to break the May 1st withdrawal agreement, but Mohammed Naeem, the Taliban spokesman in Qatar, issued a statement that the Taliban would now not take part in the 10 days of UN-led peace talks scheduled to begin in Istanbul on April 24th, nor would it take part in any further peace negotiations until the last foreign soldiers leave Afghanistan. This is a reversion to the Taliban's long-standing position that it would not negotiate with a government backed by foreign occupation forces. A reasonable position, it seems to me. U.S. envoy Zalmay Khalilzad spent years of his life negotiating with the Taliban to arrive at the 2020 withdrawal agreement. Secretary Blinken took a potentially historic step back from U.S. by unilateralism when he invited the United Nations to lead a new Afghan peace process, and Russian Foreign Secretary Sergei Lavrov set the stage for a ceasefire and a peaceful transition of power by bringing the two Afghan warring parties together in Moscow in March, where they agreed to keep talking. By reneging on the May 1st deadline, President Biden has squandered much of the hard-won goodwill and trust that was painstakingly built up through these diplomatic efforts. It was not impossible to meet the May 1 deadline. The Trump administration was steadily withdrawing troops. Biden's transition began in November, and he's been president since late January. It is also unclear whether the United States will continue the war by providing air power for the Afghan military and carrying out covert operations. Through these 2 decades, the United States has dropped more than 80,000 bombs on Afghanistan and waged a secret war with special forces, CIA operatives, of course, mercenaries, and paramilitary units. And the U.S. strikes and covert operations is as vital to peace as withdrawing U.S. troops. It's true that a U.S. withdrawal may lead to setbacks in the gains made by Afghan women and girls, but those gains have been mainly in the capital city of Kabul. 2/3 of girls in Afghanistan still receive no primary education, and Afghan women will never achieve significant advances while their country remains at war. The United States and NATO military presence has made an end to violence impossible for 20 years, as the Taliban have long made clear they will keep fighting as long as their country is under foreign occupation. And as long as the U.S. continues to prop up a weak, corrupt government in Kabul, instability and political fragmentation is inevitable. Ending the fighting and investing a small fraction of U.S. war spending in education and healthcare would do far more to improve the lives of Afghan women and girls. The United Nations, even with the full support and cooperation of the United States, will have its work cut out to convince the Taliban to rejoin talks. If the UN fails to negotiate a lasting ceasefire before the occupation forces withdraw, the U.S. and its NATO allies will be leaving a country still at war with the Taliban, the Afghan government, and various warlords vying for power. We must hope that in the coming months, the UN will find a way to bring the warring parties in Afghanistan together and craft a ceasefire and a workable peace process based on power sharing. After so many decades of war and intense suffering, much of it perpetrated by the United States and its allies, the Afghan people desperately need and deserve an end to this war. I can say that again. And next up, we have something that many people, not I, but anyway, a good many people in this country have been waiting for a long time. This is from Common Dreams on April 16th, at the end of an era, as Raul Castro steps down as Cuba's leader. The longtime first secretary's resignation means Cuba will be led by someone whose name is not Castro for the first time in over 60 years. This piece is by Brett Wilkins, staff writer at Common Dreams. For the first time since the 1950s, Cuba will have a leader whose name is not Castro. As Raul Castro announced Friday, he will step down as first secretary of the country's ruling Communist Party, just ahead of the 10th anniversary of his appointment. Castro, who has ruled Cuba since his brother Fidel resigned from the Communist Party Central Committee on April 19, 2011, announced his retirement during the 8th Party Congress in Havana, Batelisur reports. Batelisur, of course, is the Venezuelan news network. Quote, I believe fervently in the strength and exemplary nature and comprehension of my compatriots, he said to the conference. Quote again, and as long as I live, I will be ready with my foot in the stirrups to defend the fatherland, the revolution, and socialism, unquote. The 89-year-old who played a key role as a military commander in the revolution that overthrew the brutal U.S.-backed Fulgencio Batista regime in 1959, said that he has fulfilled his mission and is confident in the future of the fatherland. And Vijay Prashad tweeted, Comrade Raul Castro steps down today as the first secretary of the Communist Party in Cuba after a lifetime of service to the revolutionary cause. Venceremos. I'm not sure what venceremos means. But hopefully Evelina will translate if she is here. That was what Raul looked like in 1959. And there was Fidel. Both very young men at that time. Castro leaves office after having implemented significant economic reforms, with the government recently allowing private businesses to operate in most sectors of the economy, while the government continues to repress political freedom. Cubans still enjoy social benefits unheard of in the United States, including free cradle-to-grave health care and education. Under Castro, Cuba continued its globally renowned policy of international humanitarian assistance, which drew praise from then U.S. President Barack Obama during his historic March 2016 visit to Havana. Last year, the Cuban government sent 2,000 doctors and nurses abroad to nearly 24 nations during the coronavirus pandemic. This year's party conference coincides with the 60th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed attempt by CIA-backed Cuban exiles to destroy the revolution that ended half a century of domination of Cuba by the U.S. In 1898, the U.S. conquered Cuba from Spain, directly ruled the island as a colony for years before backing a series of dictators friendly to Washington and Wall Street interests. Matthew Petty says the CIA tweeted, just declassified documents showing that it had tried to pay a Cuban pilot for arranging an accident, unquote, on the plane carrying Raul Castro during a 1960 flight to Prague. And the United States repeatedly tried to murder the Castros, with Raul becoming the target of the earliest known CIA assassination plot against the brothers. The Castros survived more than 600 often outrageously outlandish assassination attempts against them and outlasted 12 U.S. presidents. They also defiantly endured 60 years of internationally condemned U.S. economic embargo and a decades-long campaign of terror against the Cuban people. It is widely believed that Miguel Diaz-Canel, the 60-year-old president, will replace Castro. The next Cuban leader will face an ongoing pandemic and concurrent economic crisis exacerbated by the continuing U.S. embargo, and will face internal and external pressure to enact further reforms while remaining faithful to the ideals of the revolution. So that's kind of interesting. The staying power of Cuba, of the regime, its continuing support from the population over all this time, and all this pressure by the United States is really quite astonishing. It shows the force of nationalism is very, very strong and not easily crushed, even by the heaviest the pressure that a much larger nation can exert. It's obvious the record of the Castros has been a mixed bag. There are some things that an objective observer certainly has to view as rather regrettable, but there are many things they did, focusing on the wiping out, of illiteracy in their country, the social benefits, the great healthcare system, the great things they did in raising life expectancy in Cuba, and in creating a decent, I think, quality of life for the Cuban people. All of these accomplishments, are admirable. And I think, while regretting the excesses of the regime, we ought to be objective enough to give them credit for establishing the independence of Cuba from the United States and for preventing the exploitation of its people, its citizens by the United States. Try though we did, we were never able to make the Cubans a part of the American empire after 1959. That in itself is quite an accomplishment. And so, I move on to a piece from Dave Dayen. What an in-depth program be without at least one piece from the American Prospect. And but Dave Dayen, I'm telling you, Dave is really, really hot, and that publication is really, really hot. They are doing really good stuff over a long period of time. The title of this post in the first 100 series is Biden's Climate Agenda Comes into Focus. Also, Biden's Justice Department still seizing land for the border wall. This was on April 16th. And it's by Dave Dayen. By the way, I just got through, before I signed in tonight, there was an episode, okay, of the Bad Faith program that was devoted to a panel discussion with Dave Dayen, okay, and Jennifer Ryan, talking with Bree, with Bree, okay, and Virgil, and a lot of that program explored the finer points of what Congress does, okay, with bills, and it was really excellent. But Jennifer Ryan is someone who writes about and live streams about the detail of legislation going through Congress and the processes of getting legislation through Congress. And they just had a wonderful discussion. I thought that Bad Faith program, that is the best episode of Bad Faith that I have ever seen. So I recommend you check that out. Okay, it was live today. Anyway, from an uncertain start at the beginning of his campaign, Joe Biden has earned a small measure of trust among climate activists. Many appointments were well received, particularly Deb Haaland at Interior, and people like Ali Zaidi inside the White House's climate offices. Biden accomplished some early executive actions like restoring national monuments and rejoining the Paris Agreement and recalculating the social cost of carbon. And in general, the administration has been responsive to the urgency of climate action. We saw more of that this week. One of the more interesting executive actions Biden plans to take in the coming days involves putting in place a government-wide strategy for climate-related risks. This has been a particular blind spot for federal the regulators prior to the Biden administration. Not only could natural disasters harm physical financial assets like homes and business offices and their associated mortgages and insurance policies, but shifting away from fossil fuels could strand carbon-sensitive assets, causing fire sales and broken balance sheets, which of course in turn are important because then they would have impacts on the larger economy and create the crises for all of us, depending upon how serious these problems were. This is essentially what happened in the subprime mortgage crisis, which is something that Dave's written extensively about, only instead of banks realizing too late that crappy housing loans were worthless, it would be oil and gas rigs and coal-fired power plants. It was bad news when media reports the Treasury Department would establish a client hub, which was allegedly to be held by former Fed Governor Sarah Bloom by Raskin, turned out to be completely untrue. By Jamie Raskin's wife, by the way, Congressman Jamie Raskin, one of the most lefty of the progressives in Congress. But the executive order includes data sharing through the Financial Stability Oversight Council on climate-related risk. It's a step that signals top-level support to manage the process in a way that Treasury probably cannot ignore. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office can also be a climate leader. Trade policy can be tied to climate standards. I cannot recall a single U.S.-led trade agreement even using the words climate change. But at a Center for American Progress event yesterday, that's of course Hillary's think tank, U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai laid out her vision to build climate into U.S. trade policy. The actions of the Trade Representative are enormously significant for our democracy, its direction, and its future. And it's great news that Catherine Tai has a vision to build climate into U.S. trade policy. She said leaving climate out of the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement was a mistake. And she said that polluting industries should not be outsourced to poorer countries, which could be enforced through bilateral investment treaties and other carrots. This could really change things, says Dave. And I think it's very smart for him to have noticed that. There are hitches, however. Next week, that's this week, as part of Earth Day, the U.S. is convening a climate summit. That was this morning. The invitation was put out to 40 world leaders, including Chinese President Xi Jinping, whose agreement to help mitigate the climate crisis would be the most crucial. Xi hasn't yet accepted. I don't know whether he was there. I watched a good bit of it, but I didn't see Xi, and I haven't read the articles summarizing it yet, so I don't know whether he did make it. John Kerry, the U.S. climate envoy, visited Beijing this week. Even before he got there, the official word from a house organ newspaper in the country was, quote, the U.S. has neither the moral standing nor the real power to issue orders to China over climate issues, unquote. In an AP interview, a top Chinese diplomat called the U.S., quote, too negative, unquote, and said it's, quote, not very realistic, unquote, to expect China to deliver more than what it's already promised, with emissions peaking in 2030 and going carbon neutral by 2060 on climate. It may not be very realistic, folks, but I'll bet you China beats those goals handily, because I think the Chinese know what's good for them, and they know that emissions peaking in 2030 and going carbon neutral by 2060 is not good for them. China and the U.S. have been antagonistic on a host of issues, including human rights in Tibet and Hong Kong, threats to the sovereignty of Taiwan, and claims of technology theft by U.S. multinationals. There's a strain of U.S. thought that says we must relent on this to get Chinese buy-in on climate. This is ridiculous, says Dave. China's survival depends on a livable planet, and they're well aware of that. Competition on things like supply chains could have a virtuous effect on greening manufacturing. You don't need full cooperation to have a mutual relationship that recognizes that the planet takes precedence over the internecine rivalries. Mostly the goal is to have China recognize its own interests. This is the trickiest piece of the climate push, and Biden's team must get other pieces like oil and gas drilling on public lands right. But the summit might provide another sliver of optimism on some actual global coordination. I'm not going to go through the rest of it. That was the important part, specifically relations between the United States and China in relation to climate change. That is really the important part in terms of the empire follies, because that's what we have to negotiate in the course of ending the empire, which we definitely will have to do. It's been disastrous for our democracy, as empires usually are for democracy, going all the way back to the Athenian Empire. Next, why are hawks working overtime to derail U.S.-Iran diplomacy? There's a little graphic there of the Middle East in a nutshell, with Middle Eastern warriors, but riding a Star Wars kind of I forget what that was called in Star Wars. It was kind of the Star Wars version of a tank. Okay, a robot, basically walking on four legs and firing something at a medieval a catapult staffed by what looks like something similar to R2D2. Anyway, just as talks between the United States and Iran were taking place last week in Vienna, a cyber attack was carried out on Iran's not on Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. Reports are that the Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, was behind the attack that blacked out the facility just one day after Tehran launched new advanced uranium enrichment centrifuges. And as U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was in Israel speaking about the United States, quote, enduring and ironclad, unquote, commitment to the Jewish state. This is the latest in a series of Israeli attacks on Iran designed to scuttle negotiations. Last summer, a number of explosions attributed to Israel broke out across Iran, including a fire at the Natanz site. These took place while U.S. elections were in full swing, and Biden was promising that if elected, he would return the United States to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, that Trump withdrew from in 2018. In November 2020, Israeli operatives assassinated Mosen Fakhrizadeh. Hope I got that right. Fakhrizadeh, Iran's top nuclear scientist, in the city of Absard, outside of Tehran. Had Iran responded, the United States might have been dragged into an all-out war. Israeli officials have also directly lobbied the U.S. Congress to quash the deal. In 2015, Netanyahu traveled to Washington, D.C. in 2015 to address a joint session of Congress in an attempt to uncut Obama's original negotiations. This time, Mossad chief Yossi Cohn, he has my name, will be traveling to Washington to meet with top White House and U.S. intelligence officials. And he hopes with Biden directly to convince the administration that Iran has been concealing details about its nuclear program and therefore can't be trusted. This is indeed ironic, coming from a country that, unlike Iran, actually has nuclear weapons and refuses to disclose any information about its program. And not only that, if I recall correctly, it has had nuclear weapons at least since the 1970s. It's had nuclear weapons almost 50 years. Like Israel, the powerful U.S. lobby, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, is trying to convince Biden not to go back into the JCPOA. Last month, they organized bipartisan letters in the House and Senate urging the Biden administration to insist on an expanded deal that included missiles, human rights, and Iran's activities in the region. Since Tehran has been clear that an expanded or amended deal is a non-starter, such um, quote, um, uh, um, such advice, unquote, was an attempt to quash the talks. Now, the neoconservative think tank Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, the FDD, which worked inside the Trump administration during and after Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, has been relentlessly pushing for war with Iran. After the United States recklessly assassinated Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, FDD CEO Mark Dubowitz gloated, tweeting that the deaths of Soleimani was more consequential than the killing of Osama bin Laden, quote unquote. And on April 11th, the same day as the Natanz blackout, former CIA officer and FDD fellow Rule Mark Begericht, speaking on CNN, voiced disappointment that Trump hadn't taken the United States and Iran into an all-out war. God. I mean, the bloodlust of these people is incredible. It's just incredible. Another group against a deal with Iran is Christians United for Israel, otherwise known as CUFI, C-U-F-I, one of the most powerful pro-Israel voices in the United States. In March 2021, CUFI urged the Senate not to confirm Cal, K-A-H-L, for a top policy position at the Pentagon, claiming, quote, Cal is a serial Iran appeaser, unquote, who, quote, helped advance the disastrous Iran nuclear accord, unquote. In response to the blackout at the Natanz site, they cheered Netanyahu, tweeting, quote, battling Iran is a colossal mission, quote unquote, Netanyahu says, following the blackout at the Iranian nuclear plant, unquote. The People's Mujahideen of Iran, or MEK, M-E-K, which the United States had previously designated as a terrorist organization and is known for assassinations and bombings it has carried out, is virulently opposed to U.S.-Iran diplomacy. In March 2021, a number of U.S. senators attended a virtual event organized by the MEK-aligned Organization of Iranian American Communities, the OIAC, calling for continued U.S. sanctions and, quote, bringing down the regime, unquote. That's the Iranian regime, of course. But Senator Bob Menendez, the powerful chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was among several Democrats in attendance. The opponents of the Iran deal are trying to keep in place the draconian wall of sanctions that the Trump administration imposed precisely to make it more difficult for a future U.S. administration to rejoin the JCPOA. But these sanctions are causing immense suffering for ordinary Iranians, including runaway inflation and skyrocketing food and medicine prices. According to the UN, they contributed to the government's inadequate and opaque response to the COVID-19 pandemic that has hit Iran particularly hard. While, quotes, successful, unquote, in inflicting harm on the Iranian people, the sanctions have failed to broaden the terms of the talks, have led the nation, the Iranian nation that is, to increase its uranium enrichment, has negatively impacted the human rights situation, and put the United States and Iran on the brink of an all-out war on multiple occasions. That's why so many people in Iran Those who care about them have been encouraged by this new round of diplomatic engagement. But Israel, AIPAC, Kufi, FDD, MEC, Senator Menendez, and the like, are probably instead hoping that Iran carries out the revenge that Iranian officials have called for in response to the Natanz blackout. But as the saboteurs of diplomacy hope for a violent escalation, let's keep in mind, and hope Iran agrees, that the best revenge would be a revived J.C. Poa. So that account is by Medea Benjamin, okay, and Ariel Gold, and it originally appeared at Common Dreams, and somehow I missed it there and picked it up at LA Progressive Newsletter, which is what you're seeing in front of you now. So moving along with the Empire Follies, I shall share this next piece, which is really, this case is just so reprehensible. It's just incredible. It will get you so angry. It's called The Kafkaesque Nightmare of Attorney Stephen Danziger, a literal prisoner of the Chevron Corporation. That's a picture, of Danziger there, speaking during a press conference in Quito, Ecuador, in 2014. When human rights lawyer Stephen Danziger won a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit against the oil giant Chevron, that was, if I recall correctly, a $3.4 billion lawsuit. And the company retaliated by setting out to destroy his life. Now in his 20th month of house arrest on the orders of a Chevron-linked judge, his Kafkaesque story is a window into the corrupt and corporate-captured U.S. legal system. And by the way, a U.S. legal system in service of the empire, run by a combination of U.S. government officials and neoliberal oligarchs. This is an interview conducted by Luke Savage of Jacobin, and it was published on April 15th. Human rights lawyer Stephen Danziger can rightly be called America's first corporate political prisoner. Currently living through his 20th month under house arrest, he was part of a legal team that in 2011 won a historic multi-billion-dollar lawsuit against oil giant Chevron over its activities in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Danziger, however, was afforded little time to savor this victory, soon finding himself on the receiving end of an unprecedented smear campaign and legal offensive undertaken by the company, which has ultimately seen him languish in house arrest in his New York City home for over 600 days without a trial. This state of affairs comes after an extremely dubious ruling by a judge with tobacco industry ties who has repeatedly praised Chevron. Donziger's case has attracted support from around the world, with some 55 Nobel laureates, hundreds of attorneys and legal organizations, and celebrities including Sting, Danny Glover, and Roger Waters condemning the corporate campaign against him. On May 10th, he'll be facing a misdemeanor contempt charge in a New York City court. The trial, overseen by a judge who belongs to the Federalist Society, a right-wing group that quite literally counts Chevron among its donors. Jacobin spoke with Donziger about his work exposing Chevron's crimes against the people of Ecuador, his case, and the dangerous precedent it sets in allowing corporations to persecute and prosecute their critics. And not simply their critics, but attorneys who represent nations suing the corporation. It's incredible that they can go after the attorneys. So Luke Savajax, all this began because you were part of a legal team that took action, successfully I might add, against Chevron over its activities in Ecuador. Can you tell us about that lawsuit? Catch this. I got involved in the case in April of 1993 when I was invited to join a delegation of lawyers and scientists to investigate what we had been told was maybe the world's worst oil-related catastrophe in an area of the Ecuadorian Amazon just south of the Colombia border. So we went there, and I discovered what was really an apocalyptic scene. Huge Olympic-sized pools of water that had been left in the pools of oil that had been left in the jungle. Hundreds and hundreds of these open-air toxic waste pits that Chevron had built to dispose of waste. They would put pipes into the side of these pits so they could easily run the cancer-causing contents into nearby rivers and streams that the local indigenous people and other rural farming communities relied on for their drinking water and for bathing and fishing. And there's a picture of one of those pools. It was very clear this was deliberately designed to lower production costs by polluting. So the catastrophe that we witnessed was really disturbing on a number of levels. But I think the thing that maybe most disturbed me was that it was designed to do this. It wasn't an accident. Over time, experts begin to call this the Amazon Chernobyl. And I think that by any objective metric, it's probably the worst oil-related contamination on Earth. Chevron owns it. They're refusing to take responsibility for it. And they're refusing to pay the people they harmed compensation for the damage, even though that has been ordered by multiple courts. So I got involved in 1993 and then became part of a team that pursued a legal case which culminated in a successful outcome for the people of Ecuador in 2011. Now notice, this took 18 years to do. 18 years to do. He doesn't mention that here. He just gives the dates. But it's 18 years. When the Ecuadorian court ruled Chevron was liable and owed, 9.5 billion US dollars. I thought it was 3.4 billion. 9.5 billion US dollars to the affected communities for cleanup. They have not paid a dollar and have since been pursuing an attack strategy against me and other lawyers designed to help them evade complying with the law. rather than pay the judgment of the Ecuadorian court, which has been affirmed on appeal by multiple appellate courts, including the Supreme Courts of Ecuador and Canada. Chevron has just flat out refused to comply with the law. Chevron executives have told the indigenous peoples of Ecuador that, and they've threatened them with what they call a lifetime of litigation unless they drop the case. They have threatened me with a demonization strategy in various lawsuits that have crippled me financially and have led to the removal of my law license without a hearing based on false evidence put forth by a paid Chevron witness. So ultimately, in my view, there's a scheme led by Chevron and its law firm, Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, supported by Judge Kaplan, that's the judge involved in the case, to weaponize the law in the United States to undermine the judgment of the Ecuadorian court that held Chevron liable. And they're doing that by trying to destroy and target me and try to criminalize my work. They're doing that through the U.S. justice system in a way that I believe is an egregious violation of human rights and basic decency, not to mention, by the way, democracy. They're undermining our legal system. It's very important that people understand these attacks on me are based almost completely on false evidence that Chevron put forth in the court, although Alberto Guerra, who's a man that Chevron has paid $2 million to in cash and benefits to testify against me with no corroborating evidence that I bribed the trial judge. That didn't happen. But Guerrero later admitted to lying repeatedly in Judge Kaplan's court. He admits he's corrupt. He admits he's been paid massive sums of money by Chevron in a way that violates the ethical rules of the legal profession. Yet Judge Kaplan, who is a former tobacco industry lawyer, has credited his testimony and leveraged it against me to lock me up without a jury trial on the theory that I have violated court orders that Chevron designed to cripple my advocacy. One of them is that I turn over my computer and cell phone to Chevron, and I've appealed that. And while that was on appeal, Judge Kaplan charged me with criminal contempt and had me locked up in my home, where I've been now for over 600 days without trial on a misdemeanor case, where the maximum sentence ever imposed is 90 days of home confinement. You've been under house arrest for nearly 20 months and are set to go to trial for a misdemeanor contempt charge on May 10th. As I understand it, the judge in that case has just announced she'll be shutting down Zoom access, meaning people won't be able to see what's taking place. Where do things stand right now? Stephen Donziger says, this is a trial in name only. It's actually an exercise by Chevron and Judge Kaplan to weaponize the law and try to criminalize me without a jury and without a neutral fact finder. So this is not a real trial to us. It's more of an attempt by Kaplan at farce. Think about it. I'm being charged by a judge, not by a prosecutor. The prosecutor's office refused to take the case. Kaplan appointed a private Chevron law firm, Seward and Kissel, to prosecute me in the name of the people, and my judge is a major member of the Federalist Society, which is a pro-corporate group to which Chevron itself is a major donor. So my prosecutor has financial leaks to Chevron. My judge has financial leaks to Chevron. The charging judge, Judge Kaplan, has investments in Chevron, and they're denying me jury. So my fact finder is a judge who already locked me up for almost 2 years on a misdemeanor without hearing any of the evidence. She has totally prejudged the case. So the technical result of the trial on May 10th is pretty much ordained. And if that trial happens, Judge Preska will convict me, and then I'll have an appeal, but it's not going to trial as people understand it. There's no real fact finder. What can people concerned about your case and the extremely dangerous precedent it sets do to help you ahead of May 10th and beyond. This is how people can help. You need to bear witness. So go to our website, freedonziger.org, and sign up. If you're in New York or can get to New York, try to come to the trial in person. If you can't, we're going to continue a pressure campaign to convince the court or have the appellate court order the trial judge to open the trial up at least to audio so that people can bear witness. There's a huge amount of interest around the world in attending the trial, but because of COVID, people can't travel, and the courthouse is really restricted right now. They won't open more than 20 to 25% of the capacity of a courtroom to have people attend. So Judge Preska, in my mind, is using COVID to limit public scrutiny of this very embarrassing situation. Luke Savage says, you also have a petition to the Department of Justice. There are several human rights groups and lawyers who are asking the U.S. Department of Justice, that is the Biden administration, to basically take the case out of the hands of the private Chevron law firm because it's illegal to be prosecuted by a private law firm that has a conflict of interest being run by the judge who's charged you. It's basically Judge Kaplan, who's my judge, jury, and prosecutor. That's never happened before. It's very dangerous and violates the rule of law. No country does it that way. People can also help by making a donation to the legal defense firm, which is being kept in trust by a law firm in Seattle. We've had a lot of support, a lot of small donations, so people can give $1, $5, $10, $50, $100, or whatever you can. Please help us because it does take resources to deal with this. A monster fossil fuel company that is attacking me and stopping at nothing to do it. They're using 60 law firms and 2,000 lawyers. So that's the article, folks. It's really a horror. Incredible. And of course, parts of our government are backing Chevron, our judicial system, backing Chevron. Totally corrupt, full of conflicts of interests, stubbornly denying the findings of an Ecuadorian court, which is where the trial of Chevron should have taken place. This should not be interfered with by a U.S. court. Not at all. Not at all. That it can do so is part of the activities of empire. It's about the empire. It's about the U.S. pushing Ecuador around. It's about the oligarchy pushing Ecuador around and pushing attorneys who defended Ecuador around, defying not just the Ecuadorian courts, but Canadian court as well, the Supreme Court of Canada. This is awful. It's almost as egregious as Julian Assange's case. It is terrible, and it is about the empire that compromises us as a nation. It has to go. We must be rid of this empire. Next. The old double standard again. When Trump does it, it's a coup. When it happens in Bolivia, it doesn't matter. This is a Jacobin piece by Branko Marcetic. It was done on April 15th. A little over a year apart, two remarkably similar anti-democratic incidents took place. The first you'll be familiar with, after an election that saw late counted mail-in ballots from disproportionately liberal voters vaporized Donald Trump's early lead and put his more liberal rival, Joe Biden, on top. Trump did exactly what many had predicted. He refused to concede the election, alleged fraud and other shenanigans, and spent the next weeks riling up his supporters. This culminated in at his and his allies urging a crowd of hundreds of them, I think there were thousands, some of them law enforcement and military, storming the U.S. Capitol, ostensibly hoping to stop the official certification of the result and keep Trump in power. In the process, they damaged the hallowed building, gave lawmakers a fright, and possibly killed one person, a police officer. The other four who died were members of the riot. But with even the participants themselves seemingly unsure of what they were actually trying to do, the action failed and Biden became president. Rewind 14 months to events in Bolivia. After an election that saw late counted ballots from more rural and highland areas extend left-wing President Evo Morales' early lead past the threshold for a runoff, his right-wing opposition refused to concede the election. They alleged fraud and other shenanigans, spent weeks riling up their supporters. This culminated in crowds around the country with the support of police attacking politicians from the Morales movement towards socialism, the MAS party, setting ballot boxes alight outside vote counting locations, and even breaking into Morales' house, ransacking and burning down buildings and leaving at least a dozen dead. With political instability ramping up, the military pressured Morales to step down, while hard right Christian fundamentalist Payanin Añez declared herself interim president illegally in a Senate chamber without the constitutionally required quorum. Despite their similarities and despite the substantially worse outcome in Bolivia, the two events were covered very differently in U.S. media. While the Bolivian far-right successful overturning of an election and overthrow of democracy was greeted with everything ranging from celebration to cautious optimism and even chillingly cast as a victory for democracy, Trump and the GOP's failed aping of almost this exact same playbook inspired weeks of horror, panic, and the fiercest of denunciations from these same quarters. The disparity continues today after mass protests forced Añez's coup government, which had quickly, violently cracked down on anti-coup protesters and gone after political opponents and dissidents, to hold the elections it had repeatedly delayed, leading to Massa's return to power and now her arrest for her role in the coup. Just as the press gave a thumbs up to the crushing of democracy in Bolivia before fanning itself for weeks when the right tried to do the same in the U.S. Capitol, the response to Añez's arrest has revealed what can only be described as either a stunning lack of self-awareness in the press or brazen hypocrisy. Take the Washington Post, quote, "The Bolivian government is on a lawless course. Its democracy must be preserved," unquote, ran the headline of a recent editorial accusing newly elected President Luis Arce of a, quote, "one-sided and vengeful leadership style," unquote. Putting the word coup in skeptics' quotes, it acknowledged the, quote, "sometimes deadly violence," unquote, she had encouraged against Mas supporters once president, but concluded Bolivia was now on a, quote, "lawless course," unquote, with her arrest that, quote, threatens further chaos, if not civil war and outright dictatorship. But when it was Trump in question, the Post appeared to advocate this very kind of lawless course. A selection of Washington Post headlines in the wake of the riot include, quote, Trump can and must be prosecuted, unquote. Quote, prosecuting Trump for the Capitol riot will be difficult but not impossible, unquote. And, quote, prosecuting Trump is more essential than ever, unquote. Quote, if the Senate will not ban him from holding office, a criminal conviction, should Trump be found guilty, would almost certainly do the trick, unquote, went that last one. One quote by Lincoln Project co-founder George Conway, and husband, of course, of Kellyanne Conway, acknowledged a fear of starting a cycle of political retribution, but concluded that, quote, conferring on ex-presidents blanket immunity from prosecution would also undermine the rule of law, unquote. And while the editorial board itself wouldn't go that far, only a day after the incident, it called for using the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office immediately, declaring him no longer fit after inciting, quote, an assault on the U.S. Capitol by a violent mob. It's hard to understand why the riot incited by Trump should inspire a greater revulsion than the far more violent and destructive one led by the Bolivian right. But this was a common thread in the Post's coverage. Well, its editorial board was parroting Bolivian right-wing talking points, insisting on the evidence of fraud, and characterizing the overturning of the election as, quote, the Bolivian people's massive rejection of it in the streets, unquote. The paper had no shortage of harsh, colorful language for the right-wing protesters who tried to overturn an election in their own country. A, quote, seditious posse, unquote. A, quote, deadly mob attack, unquote. A, quote, failed putsch, unquote. A, quote, siege, unquote. A, quote, strike against democracy worldwide, unquote. And, of course, and, quote, insurrection, unquote. Just because they acted under the, quote, misguided belief, unquote, that the, quote, peaceful transfer of power, unquote, was under threat, quote, does not excuse storming the symbol of our democracy, the wanton destruction of public and private property, and the utter disregard they showed for the law and for law enforcement, unquote, went one op-ed. Nor was it afraid to use the C word, despite the fact that, unlike in Bolivia, the military wasn't involved. Quote, we just saw an attempted coup d'etat, unquote, said one op-ed. In general, however, the paper settled on the formulation of the incident as a, quote, self-coup, unquote, or quoted Trump's critics to make the claim. It was similar over at the New York Times, which framed its report on Áñez's arrest around her claim of, quote, political persecution, calling Morales a, quote, divisive, unquote, leader, which is a label that could apply equally to any U.S. president, given the country's political polarization. The Times stressed that unnamed individuals had, quote, accused his government of trying to rig the vote, unquote, and suggested that Arce was using the judiciary against his opponents. The Times presumably would not level the same accusation at its own editorial board. Yet immediately after the riot, it declared that Trump and his supporters had to be, quote, held accountable, unquote, via, quote, impeachment proceedings or criminal prosecution, unquote, for any violence that took place that day. But yet another piece this one, not an op-ed, suggested that Trump should be charged with the crime, but probably wouldn't be. Elsewhere, the paper ran reported pieces that at least tacitly approved of prosecutors looking to slap Trump with criminal charges for his actions. While the Times went a little further than the Post, quote, many called it a coup, unquote. It stated following Áñez's arrest, its description of the events in Bolivia never had the same moral clarity, nor near apocalyptic treatment when discussing Trump's similar actions. The paper variously described the riot as, quote, an all-American coup attempt, unquote, and quote, attack, unquote, quote, siege, unquote, quote, rampage, unquote, even, quote, war, unquote, quote, they'd all come to coup for America, unquote, wrote one columnist. In contrast to the he said, she said coverage of the bogus fraud allegations in Bolivia's election, there was no question in the minds of the paper's editorial board of where the truth lay when it came to the same kinds of paper-thin allegations in the United States. Trump, his allies, and right-wing media had waged a campaign, quote, to overturn the results of a free and fair election, it wrote, which involved a, quote, barrage of lies about the integrity of the voting process and incited an, quote, angry crowd, unquote, all of which amounts to an unprecedented assault on the rule of law, unquote, and a, quote, a crime so brazen that it demands the highest form of accountability, unquote. Even the liberal Guardian got in on the act. A piece on Áñez's arrest headline, quote, cycle of retribution takes Bolivia's ex-president from palace to prison cell, unquote. Cited two critics of her arrest to label it an, quote, alarming development in an already profoundly divided country. Though the Guardian, to its credit, freely called the events of November 2019 a, quote, coup, unquote, it oddly equivocated on its consequences, saying only that the leftists say the coup forced Evo Morales out, that the Mas government claims the coup brought Áñez to power. Elsewhere, the paper called her arrest part of an, quote, opposition crackdown, unquote. These were all very dark descriptions of a course the paper itself had been urging for a while in relation to Trump, sometimes long before the events at the Capitol. One late December piece appeared to rubbish the idea of letting a past president off the hook for crimes in the interests of, quote, national healing, unquote. I'm glad they rubbished that idea. A later piece by columnist by Robert Reich called for Trump, one of his sons, and Rudy Giuliani to be arrested and prosecuted over the Capitol riot, and several of their allies to be barred from running for office. Nor did the paper accuse Democrats and other Trump antagonists of engaging in retribution in its numerous articles covering the prospects of criminal charges for the former president. Well, it goes on with this. And then one aspect common to all of these deserves special mention, whether the Post, the Times, the Guardian, or even Human Rights Watch all gave credence to the charge, that Evo Morales' vote total had been the result of some type of fraud, usually pointing to right-wing accusations or the Organization of American States, whose claims of clear manipulations were key to delegitimizing Morales' victory and further riling up his opponents. The fact that the head of the OAS is a conservative ally of the United States, whose tenure at the organization has been criticized by other Latin American countries, is never mentioned, nor are readers ever informed that several different studies, some of them reported on in the pages of these very same newspapers, have now shown that the claim of fraud by Morales was bunk. As the authors of a June 2020 study pointed out, Not only was the OAS's claim of a massive and unexplainable surge in Morales' votes simply its own error, because embarrassingly it had sorted timestamps for vote counts alphabetically rather than chronologically, but the way his vote margin improved was entirely in line with the fact that later reporting voting booths tended to be from his political strongholds, not unlike what happened in the U.S. election, where late arriving ballots put Biden over the top after an excruciating few days. The only difference was in Bolivia, what happened was decisive. It wasn't as narrow as it was here in the United States. Those votes came in heavy for Morales from his strongholds, really heavy. And in the end, it wasn't even close. Quote, researchers understand why late counted votes disproportionately favor the Democrats in the United States. Young and non-white voters are more likely to cast the mail-in and provisional ballots, which are more likely to be counted after Election Day. The authors wrote then, quote, while politicians and pundits often point to the blue shift as evidence of fraud, scholars find that it is predictable, unquote. In other words, even after the disgraceful post-election behavior of Trump and the GOP had horrified them so that they had all cited as a grave crime that may require criminal prosecution, these papers are nonetheless still using Trump and the GOP's exact same reasoning to continue pushing baseless charges of fraud in a completely different country. That, folks, is what the empire is about. That double standard. Even more absurdly, can't look in the mirror. The empire can't look in the mirror. Even more absurdly, they're doing so while arguing that in Bolivia, but not the United States, prosecuting a hard-right former president who overturned democracy in a coup is itself an alarming threat to democracy. What can one even say to this? When the Trump era began, there were high hopes that as the press became more combative, it would be more willing to call a spade and less willing to wallow in faux objectivity just because some sort of corner had been turned in political discourse. Instead, we're still dealing with a political establishment that spent 4 years learning that Trump was bad and why, and nothing else. That, folks, was a great piece on the hypocrisy with which the empire operates, the use of double standards and lies, and transparent dishonesty. And the very last piece for tonight, dirty campaigning underlies Ecuador's, quote, free and fair, unquote, election. This was picked up from the LA Progressive, and it was another piece by Medea Benjamin, this time with Leonardo Flores, a well-known figure, from Ecuador, as her co-author. Published originally by Code Pink. Did I say Medea Frank? I'm sorry, it's actually Medea Benjamin, of course. I happen to know a Medea Frank, so that is why I misspoke at that point. At any rate, Ecuador's April 11th election led to a 5-point victory by conservative banker Guillermo Lasso over progressive candidate Andres Arauz. Was not what it appeared to be. On the surface, it was a surprisingly clean and professional election as our Code Pink official observer delegation witnessed, but a fraud-free process for casting and counting ballots does not mean that the election was free and fair. Behind the scenes was a monumentally unequal playing field and dirty campaign designed to quash and arouse win. For starters, arouse a 36-year-old follower of the political leanings of former President by Rafael Correa and his Citizens Revolution, barely even got on the ballot. The political party he tried to run under was banned by the National Electoral Council, the CNE. He and his supporters formed a new political party, and that too was banned. Eventually, they found a small party that let them borrow their slot, but by then it was late December, and the first round of elections was on February 7th. The other campaigns had a 4 or 5 month head start. And so Arouse, who was virtually unknown, wanted to have Rafael Correa as his vice president, but the CNE, the National Electoral Council, banned Correa from being on the ticket. Even more astounding, the electoral authorities actually prohibited the Arouse campaign from even using Correa's voice or image. But in a show of blatant bias, they didn't manage Correa's image from being used in a negative way by his opponents. Another intense obstacle was the role of the media. The corporate media dominate all the airwaves in Ecuador, and they were clearly in the Lasso camp. The media led a dirty campaign spreading fake news about Arouse, Correa, and their supporters. They scared people by claiming that Arouse was going to de-dollarize the economy. Ecuador has been using the dollar as its currency since 2000, after a financial crisis saw the collapse of its former currency, the sucre. An economist, Arouse, was well aware that dollarization had stabilized Ecuador's economy, and he never even suggested going back to the sucre. A particularly absurd assumption came from Colombia, where the country's right-wing attorney general claimed that the National Liberation Army, an armed insurgent group that has been operating in Colombia for decades, made an $80,000 loan to Arouse's campaign. Based on a doctored video that was proven to be false, this accusation, nevertheless, continued to circulate throughout the press to sully Arouse's character. A concerted smear campaign also attacked the legacy of Rafael Correa to scare people away from voting for Arouse. During his time in power from 2007-2017, Correa brought economic and political stability to a country that had had 7 presidents in 10 years. Correa has a PhD in economics, completely transformed Ecuador into a modern democracy with a vibrant middle class. He also brought tremendous gains to the poor, reducing poverty from 37% to 22%, and built critical infrastructure, including highways, hospitals, and schools. But the portrayal in the media made Correa out to be a corrupt authoritarian who was a threat to democracy, creating a dilemma for the Arouse campaign about how much to align itself with his legacy. The media smear campaign went hand in hand with attacks on the left that had been going on for the past 4 years under the presidency of Lenin Moreno. Ironically, Moreno had been Rafael Correa's vice president, ran on the ticket of Correa's Citizens Revolution. But once in power, he orchestrated a kind of, quote, silent coup, betraying Correa, the Citizens Revolution, and the progressive policies they stood for, making common cause with the elites, including Lasso. He imposed austerity policies and signed a terrible deal with the IMF that focused on budget cuts. In other words, he imposed the essence of neoliberalism on that country: deregulation and reducing workers' rights. In October 2019, there was an uprising against the elimination of a fuel subsidy that would have raised prices on everything from transportation to food. It was put down violently by Moreno's government, and many of the protest leaders remain in prison today. Lasso supported Moreno's austerity measures to deal with the IMF and the violent crackdown on protesters. Yet his campaign successfully managed to create distance between him and Moreno. The narrative spun in the media was that Arrows would continue in the footsteps of Lenin Moreno and Correa, as if, but Lenin Moreno had not betrayed the movement. Um, but anyway, Moreno viciously lashed out at the left through the misuse of the legal system for political purposes, a tactic known as lawfare. Jorge Glass, the vice president for Moreno, who spoke out against his betrayal of the citizens' movement, was accused of corruption, convicted, put in jail, where he remains under dire conditions. Also, Moreno's government attacked Correa himself, who went into exile in Belgium to avoid being thrown into prison. There are about 30 charges pending against Correa, including a farcical accusation that he had psychic influence over people that led them to become corrupt. Other top party leaders were hounded and are now either jailed under house arrest or forced into exile. The decapitation of the revolution meant, that Arouse's campaign was significantly weaker than it would have been with their help. Given all the strikes, against Arouse, it is remarkable he did so well. Had it not been for lawfare, a biased CNE, and a dirty campaign, he would have won. However, another major factor was the rift between the citizens' revolution and the indigenous movement that happened under Correa's tenure, which led to calls for a, quote, no vote, unquote. The Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, CONE, and its political party, Pachakutik, were represented in the first round of voting by Yaku Perez, who did well but didn't make the final cut. Feeling that neither of the two presidential candidates represented the indigenous community, Perez called for people to spoil their ballot by voting no. Voting is mandatory in Ecuador, so a spoiled ballot is the equivalent of boycotting the election. There was some dissent from the vote no position. Just days before the election, CONE President Jorge Vargas came out in favor of Arouse, but a significant percentage of indigenous peoples voted blank. Roughly 1.7 million Ecuadorians decided to either vote blank or to spoil their ballot. That was a critical factor in the election, given that Lasso won by only about 420,000 votes. Accused of enabling a right-wing victory, some members, of Pachakutik argued those voted no because they believe they can bring down the Lasso government through popular uprisings, similar to what occurred in October 2019. A victory by Arouse would have helped people struggling during this pandemic. The health situation was so mismanaged by Moreno that Ecuador is one of the world's worst COVID death rates, and the economy has been devastated. Arouse would have also strengthened the left throughout all of Latin America, and also promoted the kind of regional integration that took place during the so-called Pink Tide in the early 2000s, when a succession of progressive governments took power in Latin America and the Caribbean. New institutions were created, such as the Union of South American Nations, like UNASUR, and CELAC, CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. These became a counterbalance to the Organization of American States, which is used as a tool of the U.S. State Department to promote U.S. foreign policy throughout the region, which, of course, is the foreign policy of empire throughout the whole of Latin America. These new regional organizations were part of a much broader vision of regional integration along the lines of the EU. If those organizations were as strong now as they had been several years ago, it's likely that Latin America would have been in a better position to deal with the pandemic because they could have bought vaccines together and cooperated on public health policies. In the coming years, Ecuador's citizens' revolution will have to use this time to regroup, repair frayed by relations with indigenous and union groups, and build a strong social base of support. This social base is something they never really achieved, even under Correa's mandate. They do, however, still have a majority in the National Assembly. The biggest assembly bloc is the indigenous party, Pachacutec, which will undoubtedly be courted by Lasso's government, but also has left tendencies. So there may be room to make alliances and fight back against Lasso's austerity policies on the regional level. It's a shame that Ecuador won't be helping to swell the ranks of the pink tide, but hopefully other nations in Latin America, such as Peru, Chile, also Brazil, and even Colombia, have a chance in the coming years to keep the second wave of the pink tide afloat. Let us hope so, because Latin America really needs the pink tide once again. So, that's the last of my direct message for tonight. There's KRTD Media. Hey, Joe. Hey, KRTD Media. How you doing? And let me go back to the beginning and entertain your comments. Carmen says, Kay says, shared. Carmen says, hello, sending love and peace and chicken grease. KRTD Media says, hey, Joe. Hi, Indy. How are you? I'm sure this is Indy left. And Steve says, Caitlin Johnstone, the U.S. didn't re-enter Iraq in 2014 to stop ISIS. They re-entered Iraq in 2014 to stop Soleimani from stopping ISIS. Gina Marie says, hi. Hi, Gina Marie. Evelina Pond says, sorry, missed it. Kay says, Venturismo. Something like that, Evelina. Venturismo means we shall overcome. Thank you, Kay. Oh, that was good. Vijay Prasad says, we shall overcome. Kay says, thank you, Evelina. Steve Gonza says, we're all weird, naked monkey mutants constructed from the fibers of murder. The most self-righteous among us is just a self-righteous murder monkey. The most wicked among us is just the wicked monkey. The saddest loser among us is just a failed murder monkey. That was from Caitlin Johnstone, Substack. We're all weird, naked murder monkeys. Lana Dell says, oddly enough, are being barred from traveling there, Cuba. As tourists has allowed the island to remain pretty pristine. One of my co-workers visited a few years ago and said it was beautiful. Kay says Cuba takes care of its people. Steve Gonzo says, save the seaweed. Evelina says, is that what we are? Steve says, I come from the water. Seventh generation. Kay says, when will the U.S. learn we can't run the whole world? I don't know. You can't seem to learn that particular lesson. They still think somehow that they can get there, that they can still be running the world with a neoliberal type of empire. They even still believe that that's the key to world peace, that nations governed by a regime of international trade that benefits only the oligarchs are going to create world peace. That seems to be the motivating ideal behind our foreign policy oligarchs. That's probably what Tony Blinken believes. Lana says, can't stand that Netanyahu, Israel's Trump, except he's a whole lot smarter than Trump, I'm afraid. Steve Gonza says, oh, forgive me tonight. I'm out of alcohol. Sorry, Steve. Kay says, hate it when that happens, Steve Gonzo, laugh out loud. Steve Gonzo says, SJW, how I came to Twitter to flirt with cuties, and now I'm a commie. Kay says, don't do Twitter, and I'm glad now that I don't. Laugh out loud. I've enjoyed Twitter so far. Evelina says, we saw footage of those contaminated pools in the Ecuadorian Amazon. But Mia Farrow and other high-profile figures did spots on behalf of the indigenous persons who live there. Steve Gonzo said, Stacey Abrams said, and I quote, I'm not going to do class warfare. I want to be wealthy. She sits on the board of both Neera Tanden's CAP and the largest Democratic super PAC in the country. There's a reason the liberal establishment loves her. Never forget, Steve, it's the neoliberal establishment. It's not the liberal establishment. There ain't no liberal establishment. Now they're called the progressives. And Evelina says, crooked Judge Kaplan. And Lana says, wow, locked at home for 600 days. Dia Swift says, oh my God, corporate fascism. Got to share this info ASAP. Evelina says, that is obscene. Lana says, where can we donate to help that person? I think I mentioned that. Go to the Jacobin article. All the information is linked from the Jacobin article to where you can go to donate to help out that person. Stephen Donziger. Kay says, I've heard about this for a while now. Shake my head. And Dia Swift said, the earth is being persecuted and prosecuted. Hashtag down with Chevron. Steve Gonzo says, the people of Myanmar and San Francisco held a protest in front of at Chevron to stop supporting the Myanmar junta. NUG assembled. Hashtag what's happening in Myanmar. Hashtag April 17 coup. Deborah Wilson says, what does it feel like under Joe Biden? This is all swimming upstream. He's not there. He was always on the wrong side of everything his whole entire life. Hello? Well, it's true. It's true, Deborah. It is like swimming upstream under Joe Biden. It is. We knew it was going to be like swimming upstream under Joe Biden, didn't we? Evelina says, that is evident. Still, we keep applying pressure where we can. Kay says, I'm not at all happy with Biden either, but we have no choice but to work with what we have. But we can work with what we have by protesting, by working against what we have. Kay says, Jacobin is great, sometimes. Steve Gonzo says, Brazil offers to cut deforestation by 40% in exchange for $1 billion from the U.S., okay, by Tim O'Donnell. I know they offer. The problem is we cannot trust Bolsonaro to use the money to refrain from cutting the deforestation there.
He lives on the earth. Why can't he share it the way we do?
But I mean, I would say this, though, okay, in a New York second. If there was somebody heading Brazil who we could trust to take care of that, like Lula da Silva, then I would happily give him 10 times that much to stop deforestation in Brazil. 20 times that much. It would be cheap at the price. Kay says, I was amazed to even see them show up for the summit today. Me too. He lied through his teeth at the summit. I saw that. He was lying like the fascist he is. Evelina Pont said, why are they asking for money in exchange? Because he's a fascist. Kay says, Evelina Pont, because that's what they want. No way to see if they will even follow through if we do that. How would we enforce that? We can't. Evelina says they hated Correa because he reached out to other left governments, as he was also progressive himself. I know. Evelina says Correa's wife is from Belgium. That is why they live there. Well, of course they're living there now because they can't go back to Ecuador. But yes, he moved to Belgium at first to do academic work there, and also to be with his wife's family there. I think her parents, were getting quite old. But anyway, they wanted to be in Belgium for some years. It was personal family matters. Kay says Evelina Pont, Argentina, showed up today, but I couldn't make out what they said too well. I think Argentina was very supportive. They have a lefty regime there. At some point, they are prepared, I think, to do what is necessary. They will be collaborative on this, at least if this regime stays in control. But of course, the United States is probably trying to undermine the Argentinian regime, or at least has been in the past. I don't think we were very friendly to it under Trump. Biden may be a bit different. He may be willing to tolerate the regime. However, remember, Christina Kirchner is the vice president. And Kay says, sorta, but not too well. And Steve Gonzo says, at FLOTUS, Dr. Jill Biden met with Navajo Nation President Jonathan Nez and women leaders in California. Evelina says, oh, well, essentially Argentina pledges to abide by the Paris Accords. Kay says, we need more than that, but it is a start, Evelina. Evelina says, I agree. Steve Gonzo says, https, twitter.com, Donziger. And Dia Swift says, but at least we're not upstream in a fascist damnation. That is true. We would have been swimming upstream in a fascist hell if Trump had won again. If he had won again, in spite of how terrible he was, as president, there is no telling what he would have done. No telling what he would have done. It would have been full-on Mussolini. Full-on Mussolini here. Anyway, folks, I think that's it for tonight. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for staying. Thank you for tweeting. Thank you for helping out. I will see you again on Saturday. Swimming upstream. Lana says thanks. And good night, Kay. We love you. And Dolores says thank you and night all. And good night to you, Dolores.